This evening, we're going to talk about American ignorance and global anti-Americanism. Brendan O'Connor joined the United States Study Center in 2009 as Associate Professor in American Politics. He was previously with the Department of Politics and Public Policy at Griffith University. He was an Australia Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington in 2008, and in 2006 he was a Fulbright Fellow at Georgetown University. He is the editor of 7 books on anti-Americanism, so he has spent many years studying this issue, and has also published articles and books on American welfare policy, presidential politics, U.S. foreign policy, and Australian-American relations. Please join me in welcoming Brendan O'Connor.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to talk tonight a lot about foreign travellers who came to the United States in the early 19th century, and many of these foreign travellers came with hopes and aspirations that were sometimes dashed, and they wrote books that were occasionally rather grumpy and left, I think, a rather lasting legacy of impressions and stereotypes about Americans. So I thought it would be appropriate to talk about my own journey here to this podium over the last couple of days. A couple of days ago I left Sydney, Australia. I was just about to head out to the airport and I got a phone call from United Airlines saying my flight had been cancelled and they'd put me on the next plane, and that was in 2 days' time. I just thought, oh well, I'll miss this event, I'll miss other things I've set up. I said, well, what's the problem? They said, oh, mechanical problems. So I ring my travel agent and she says, oh yes, we've heard from United. Apparently the plane hasn't actually left the United States. It was delayed. There was some scheduling problem. So I was already thinking, was there enough passengers? I finally get a call about 4 hours later saying I can get on a plane later that night and I'll get to Los Angeles, not by United, another airline. But I have to, once I go to Los Angeles, wait in the airport for 7 hours, and then I can go to San Francisco, and then I can go across America to various milk run, and I'll get to Baltimore, and then I'll be able to get to this tour. So I'm thinking, that's tremendous. I'm really looking forward to this, and I got to LA, and I was lucky enough to get a direct flight after 7 or so hours at LAX to Baltimore. And things had gone reasonably well on the flight. I was, only about 34 hours of travel had sort of expired at this point. So I had to get a taxi to Virginia. I was originally coming into Dulles Airport, and the taxi driver got lost. And they couldn't find my hotel, and there was about an hour where it was just sort of randomly driving around the freeway. And I was thinking, I've travelled to London quite a lot, I was thinking, is there anything like the knowledge here, and he was sort of blaming me, saying I needed to direct him here. So although most of my work is trying to explain the United States to Australians and others and suggest that we should avoid anti-American stereotypes, I feel like I've been in a controlled experiment for the last couple of days to sort of boil my blood on all things American and see how far it can push me towards anti-Americanism. In 1999, Caspar Weinberger, the former Secretary of Defense, gave a talk at the World Affairs Council in Los Angeles. Weinberger claimed that less than 50% of US congresspersons have a passport. In the year 2000, the New York Times looked into this. I mean, this is a wide sort of believed idea that very few members of the US Congress have passports. In Australia, I was looking at a textbook, a sort of introduction to world politics the other day, and in that textbook, to my amusement, was this claim that 80% of US congresspersons do not have a passport. So I tried to look into some kind of factual data on this, and I came up with a New York Times study of 2000, which showed 93% of US congresspersons have a passport. And I imagine since 9/11, that has increased. Another statistic I'll throw at you, or another little sort of vignette, is in 2002, National Geographic did a study of young people in 9 developed nations, about their knowledge of geography. And Americans did quite poorly in that study. They often finished at the bottom with Mexicans. And one of the findings of that study was, on a multiple choice range, the most popular answer given to the question, what is the population of the United States, by Americans, was between 1 and 2 billion people. So I suppose these two examples, this urban myth, which Caspar Weinberger even believed, and this questionable understanding of the United States population, raises one of the dilemmas at the heart of my work recently. And that's when understanding stereotypes about American ignorance or insularity or unworldliness, we're faced often with this combination of myths, lies sometimes, and factual evidence. The sort of complex mix of these things. And to decipher these things and make sense of them, I think is quite challenging. And I think it's quite challenging because few people have ever taken this subject very seriously in an academic way. That's why I've been able to publish 9 books on the topic, is because up until very recently, this was a topic of a lot of conversation, a lot of barroom banter, a lot of newspaper ink was spilled, but very few academics, people like myself who work for universities, had ever put any effort into researching this. It's a very under-researched area, how much Americans know about the rest of the world, why people in other countries might dislike or like Americans. Very few books. One of the few books that I could find on American insularity written in recent times was by a professor from Georgia, a man by the name of Locke Johnson, who wrote a book called The 7 Sins of American Foreign Policy. Now this book makes, I think, many good points, but most of the data in this book about American insularity, which was written about 3 or 4 years ago, is from the 1970s and 1980s. Man, it seems wholly inadequate. If this was a standard of research we held for most things, this book wouldn't even be published. But this is a topic that very few people have written about. So I've made an effort to try to fill this gap and say, if we're going to take this claim about American insularity and that Americans know less about the rest of the world than other developed nations or peoples in developed nations, then what would be the evidence for this? And I've taken a two-tiered approach, and I'll spend about 10 minutes on each one of these things. The first thing I've done is to say, well, where does this idea originate from? Where does it come from? What's the history of it? How far back does it go? It didn't just come about with George W. Bush. Secondly, I've looked at some kind of statistical basis for this. Can you say that there's some way you might be able to measure this? Is there some kind of data, to use a political science or social science term? And the things I've looked at for data of kind of worldliness, knowledge of geography, because there's these surveys, how much current affairs Americans read or watch or listen to, how much study of foreign languages there is in the United States at universities, but at all levels, and English is a second, how much competency in other languages, amount of travel to foreign countries, all sorts of indicators. So there's this long list of things, and I've luckily had a couple of very able people helping me collect all this data to try to say, what is the composite picture? I want to start off, however, with George W. Bush. I said before that these things predate Bush, and I'll argue they really predate him by nearly 2 centuries. But I think Bush is an obvious lightning rod for a lot of these long-standing stereotypes about the United States to come to the fore, people to want to read and publish books on these things and write books, because he fits so many of these long-standing tropes, stereotypes, I think, surprisingly well, or he fits them in a way that is so familiar or feels familiar for many foreigners. His malapropisms, his mangled speech, his apparent lack of knowledge when coming to the presidency of foreign leaders, his lack of apparent interest in foreign policy, all created this image, I suppose, that had been written about in a rather contradictory way in that novel of the 1950s of an ugly American, and curious about the outside world, but with a very powerful global reach. It wasn't helped by a number of occasions during the 2000 campaign where he referred to East Timorese people as East Timorans, or Greeks as Grecians, or confusing Slovakia and Slovenia, but many people do that, or this reference to Kosovars as Kosovans. I think it was Andy Hiller on Boston television who confronted Bush with a pop quiz of what were 4 leaders of, Taiwan, Chechnya, Pakistan, and got it written down somewhere here, and India. And Bush was sort of splitted out, Lee, and I suppose got one correct. This gave, I suppose, this impression, and this is the type of thing that tends to get very widely reported around the rest of the world. And there's maybe in some ways a trivial moment in the campaign, or I suppose an equivalent in the last campaign, was this claim that Sarah Palin thought Africa was a country, not a continent. Now that turned out to be an apocryphal story, really it was actually a slur or an attempt to sort of maligned Palin from people in the McCain campaign, but that was reported in tremendous sort of detail in many different places. I remember being in Washington at the time and clicking on a newspaper in Australia, apparently the most quality newspaper in Australia, and there it was on the front page of its webpage, these claims about Sarah Palin. These things tend to travel very quickly because, as I'll argue in the next 20 minutes or so, they fit a very long-standing set of stereotypes. But back to George W. Bush. For many, it wasn't as though Bush was just seen as an aberration outside of the United States, but rather a product of an unworldly society. Cordell Hull once claimed that the American government is never far ahead or never far behind the American public. When Ronald Reagan was asked what is his secret of his popularity, he did not hesitate to attribute the fact that many Americans, when they saw him, saw themselves. Now, this is rather hard to imagine Francois Mitterrand saying, or Jacques Chirac saying that when the French people see me, they see themselves. I think it... I'll just have a quick water. I think it could be said that a lot of other nations see their leaders as much more clearly as distinct from themselves, as much more elitist or out of touch, or doing a career that is rather odd and strange. Where I think the United States sees its presidents, for better or worse, or fairly or unfairly, as reflective of its nation. I mean, you saw this through the 2000 campaign, this claim, or the 2008 campaign, this claim that if Obama was to win, America had somehow got over its legacy of racism. But if he was to lose, even by a thin margin, this was a sense that America was still a racist nation. Now, this might be the difference between a few million votes. This notion that the president represents some major sort of trend or some notion of this as a kind of representative of a nation is, I think, a much stronger trend in the United States than many other places. And I think this is why Bush was seen to sort of not just be a commentary about American government, but a commentary or a reflection about the American people. As I said before, there's nothing new about these claims. Where do they start? Well, I suppose my thesis in the book that I'm working on at the moment, which I suppose has some kind of title like Insular Nation, is that the really key period for these set of stereotypes, which was used to talk about Bush, which is used to talk about Palin, which is used to talk about Ronald Reagan in many places, Lyndon Johnson, really was cemented in the period between about 1820 and 1850. That this was the period where these stereotypes were developed, propagated, lapped up in many regards, and have ever since been just refined or developed or reused. This was a period of really strong interest about the United States and Europe. It was a period where a number of British writers, travel writers, novelists, came to the United States and found that they could find a ready audience back home by telling stories about this new, somewhat unusual place. It was in a reflective moment that Oscar Wilde wrote, "English people are far more interested in American barbarism than they are in American civilization." And I suppose this was a sense of when these people came to the United States that they wanted to go to places which were for them rather unusual. They were drawn to the frontier quite often, to the Mississippi River. And I've looked at about 30 of these travel writers and novelists from this period. And I think this is an overwhelming case of evidence of very sort of similar portrayals of the United States, the same kinds of tropes, evidence that they tend to compile to create this composite picture, which often isn't that flattering. It's possibly one of the most unflattering periods of kind of transatlantic commentary, but I think these tropes remain and live on. The picture they build up is often of the American that is unsophisticated but boastful, culturally backward but ultra-patriotic. I suppose the best example in some ways of this this very negative set of stereotypes is Francis Trollope's book, The Domestic Manners of the American. Now this is, I think, one of 20 or 30 books that I could have chosen, but because of the nature of her language, I think it lends itself to some sort of brief amount of time being chosen on this book rather than, I think there are others that are fairly similar. And she is a good example of the kind of rather grumpy traveller as well, because things don't quite work out for Mrs. Trollope as she'd quite dreamed them to work out when she first arrived in the United States. Throughout that book, there is the constant complaint about the disrespect for her personal privacy, the blandness, the incessant and remorseless spitting that she encounters, the hypocrisy, particularly regarding slavery, the poor posture of Americans. This is something that people in these early 19th century travel logs and books and novels constantly comment on. Feet on tables, people slouching, particularly in Congress. People find this something that they wish to tell the British and European publics quite a lot about. I have a personal fascination with George W. Bush, and I spent a bit of time at his father's library in College Station, Texas, looking into work that I might one day do on Bush. And I haven't progressed very far with the idea of writing a book on Bush, but I think if I did, I at least have a working title, which might be something like "He Governed with Cowboy Boots on the Table," or the sense of, and this image of Bush in so many cartoons around the world is often portrayed that way. And I think in that Oliver Stone movie, there's a kind of classic moment with the cowboy boots on the table. There's just this kind of iconic stereotype, really. Eating with one's knife, speed eating, the lack of polite conversation at the table. I mean, she was predated, Trollope, in many ways by Talleyrand on this front, who I think famously said when he came to America quite a bit earlier that Americans had 32 religions and just one dish, which I think he said was unedible. Trollope, and a theme that you found 100 times in the British press during the Bush presidency, was to say at one point in her book, "I very seldom during my whole stay in the country heard a sentence elegantly turned and correctly pronounced from the lips of an American." She was worried about this informality of American society, the use of Christian names, the use of words like honey, people you barely knew. This frustration was also a frustration of Dickens. I mean, Charles Dickens' writings, American Notes, Martin Chuzzlewit, you see this similar set of concerns, some would say very Victorian English concerns, but I think rather sort of enduring concerns. This concern about hypocrisy is clearly there in Dickens' letters as well. I remember a letter that sticks in my mind from Dickens is where he writes that America is the greatest blow to liberty in the world. I mean, this is rather like going to the Soviet Union and say 1950 and saying that the Soviet Union is the greatest blow to communism in the world. I mean, he feared for radicals who came to the United States who held it up. He makes much commentary of the blandness of American society. There's the Australian author Peter Conrad, who wrote that Dickens' English characters have far too much character and his American characters have none. This sense of kind of these people are without personality to some extent. I mean, de Tocqueville, people when I'm talking about this kind of period always throw de Tocqueville at me and say, well, de Tocqueville, wasn't he tremendously impressed? Well, they've probably never read de Tocqueville. I mean, sure, there's a lot of admiration in some ways for America being the future being democracy in many ways, but there's a lot of social criticism in de Tocqueville. This concern about the conformity of mind in the United States, the constant need for praise that he finds annoying patriotism, I think is one of his phrases, and this cultural set of concerns about America as a very middling cultural place. I think at one point in the second volume of Democracy in America, he writes that there will be no poetry in America because Americans will never reach these kind of higher arts, that everyone might be broadly educated, but without a kind of leisure class, the highs of European culture will never be reached. Others talk of the lack of literature in the United States, the crudeness of United States culture, its uncouthness, its money-grubbing nature. I suppose Dickens is famous for coining the phrase, the worship of the almighty dollar in the United States. Now, at least you get the impression that this was just a European thing. In many regards, this reflected an internal conversation in the United States as well. I mean, writers particularly from the East Coast or who reside in the East Coast of the United States, people like James Fenimore Cooper, were saying very similar things, of even predating Trollope in many regards. I mean, Fenimore Cooper's books, Homeward Bound and Home is Found, had many of these concerns about Jacksonian democracy, about what nature of the United States as a kind of unsophisticated, culturally unsophisticated place. Okay, a bit of analysis. why were these people saying these things? Well, a lot of it was reflective of where they travelled. That they went to places which were at the frontier of the United States, where the United States, I suppose, was least formed in a kind of a traditional cultural sense. There was the weakness of traditional institutions, schools and the like. Trollop's own story of going to Cincinnati and setting up a bazaar which failed. And it also reflected many of these comments, European fears. Fears about class levelling, fears about the reform bills back home in Britain, fears that what democracy might bring to their own countries, fears of mass culture, kind of how that would affect their own sensibilities. And these are very much, as I said, Victorian sensibilities. Even a bit later on in Oscar Wilde's writing, which seems witty and frivolous and poking fun at Victorian sensibilities, is terribly Victorian at times. A sense of order, what children should be saying in their place, and all the rest of it. Okay, to the data in the kind of remaining 7 or 8 minutes. So this historical story for me kind of builds up to this picture to say these things have really been there to draw upon, depending on kind of as anti-American waves have risen and fallen, depending on certain presidents or actions of American politicians, but that we have a whole store of tropes, we have a store of language to call upon, particularly maybe outside the United States, but in some ways for people in the United States as well, that make it very easy to pigeonhole a politician quite quickly. Katie Couric interviews Sarah Palin. Most people in the world never heard of Sarah Palin, but quickly they have a very strong view of what type of person Sarah Palin is. Now, some of you might be sympathetic with that view, but it is interesting how quick to judge these people because I think of these enduring and well-established views of Americans there are. Okay, to the data. What does that tell us? What if we try to test these things in a kind of in a social scientific way? These impressions, at least. Perceptions. Well, the National Geographic study is kind of an interesting place to start just because it provides some kind of evidence that I think is easy to grasp. In 1988, National Geographic did this study of 9 nations, and they interviewed people between the ages, or they tested them between the ages of 18 and 24. They did this in Canada, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Sweden, and the USA. The US in all 3 of these studies, 88, 2002, 2004, performed very poorly. It tended to finish right near the bottom with the Mexicans. The Brits and the Canadians did a little bit better, not tremendously better, and the Germans and the Swedes did very, very well. There's a huge gap between the knowledge of Americans of this age and Swedes and Germans in general. A few figures from the 2002 study are kind of interesting. Only 14% of young Americans could locate Israel on a map of the Middle East. 13% could locate Iraq. 13% could locate Iran. This actually improved reasonably considerably between the 2002 and 2004 surveys. We're almost doubling in some of these categories. It brings to mind, I think, a rather harsh quote from Beers Ambrose, who once wrote that God invented war to teach Americans geography. That these things were in the press, and I suppose they became more familiar. Americans were also the least knowledgeable about where the Taliban or Al-Qaeda was based, other countries they were based in. As I said before, it was the weakest on guessing the population of the United States. It had the most exaggerated view of what that population was. Really, the most popular guess was between 1 and 2 billion people. Very poor at locating Britain. It was much better actually at locating Australia on a world map. I suppose it is a kind of distinctive looking place. I mean, the vast majority in all of these geographical studies of Americans cannot locate Britain on a world map, which to me seems kind of remarkable, but that's what the facts say. What are the reasons for this? So we kind of try to dig down. Well, some people said, well, Americans don't study geography in school anymore, it's just too boring, it's been overtaken by social studies, and Swedes and Germans are still into that kind of precise stuff. Other people have said, well, it's the lack of travel. Swedes and Germans, there's all these borders close together, get to travel more. No doubt they'd be more interested in other countries. They have more study abroad, maybe. There's some evidence in these studies. They ask people how much they read about other countries, foreign news they take in. that young people in these other countries, particularly the European continental countries and the Scandinavian countries, read more, watch more world news than Americans, so they're more familiar with these places. One of the findings I found interesting was that a majority of Americans who were surveyed believed that Americans knew more or knew the same amount about world geography as people in other countries. So there was no sense of great awareness that they were going to perform as a country poorly in these surveys, or rather a degree of confidence that Americans would be just as good as other countries in these types of surveys. Another thing I've spent quite a lot of time recently looking at is language training in the United States, the amount of foreign language studied at schools. Your Foreign Language Association puts together a lot of good statistics on this, so you can trawl through these. This has been interesting. Some of the rises are pretty obvious. Studies of Arabic and the likes at September 11. But I suppose I've been trying to look through various agencies in the United States to just get a sense of the kind of bilingual knowledge base, this understanding of particular languages. The best evidence I can find is about 13% of those who work for the CIA are bilingual. There were studies, the New York Times has been quite into a lot of this, that of the 1,000 embassy staff in Baghdad, 33 are Arabic speakers and 6 are fluent Arabic speakers. 2005 New York Times study of the State Department showed that the State Department, although it has quite a number of people who claim to be Arabic speakers, only had 8 Arabic speakers at a native level working in the US State Department. So these compiling these sets of data, at least I feel, gives me some starting point. We obviously want to look for comparative data on this. This is why the geography study is neat, because it's a nice little comparative study. Studies of foreign language, there is some comparative data. There's a lot of data from the Soviet Union, in fact from the 50s onwards, which strikes me as probably quite unreliable, which tends to show that the Soviets sent basically anyone who was sent abroad to a foreign country was totally fluent in the language of that country. Some of you might remember this book, The Ugly American, that I referred to before. At the back of that book it has a factual epilogue where it makes numerous claims that nearly all Soviet diplomats are totally fluent in the country they go to, whereas most American diplomats aren't. Well, I'm open to believe that the Soviet diplomats were more fluent, but the statistics I have I'm not particularly sort of taken by, and those who have asked, as Russian experts, have tended to say don't take those too seriously. But that's the kind of information I suppose I've been trawling through all sorts of forms of data and having these people work with me to try to build up this composite picture to say what are the facts as best we could compile them, how do they compare to these set of very strong conceptions or preconceptions or sort of these, I suppose for lack of a better word, these stereotypes about Americans that people hold very broadly wherever I go or travel or speak to my students about these things. How do these two things match up? And what's the story we can tell if we look for some kind of hard evidence against these rather strong and rather strongly held perceptions? They're not just sort of a thing weakly held, but I think perception often based on a degree of anecdotes. Be like me sort of using my taxi driver yesterday as a representative American. Probably not entirely fair. Okay, to conclude. I've argued here that these stereotypes are enduring, that the most negative stereotypes about Americans very much predate the presidency of George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan. For me, the key period in the formation of these stereotypes is the 1820s to the 1850s. I think, in fact, there was a more positive view of the United States in the colonial period, in the revolutionary period, the period of American independence. I think there's actually a more positive view in Europe. But it's difficult because Americans in some ways aren't Americans at that time. They're colonists, they're British to some extent, who are just living in this other place. So with formal sort of nationhood comes much more of a sense of Americans as a distinct form of people as well. It's not to say there wasn't earlier criticism, but a lot of it often focused on the natural environment, on the problems of that people would encounter trying to live in such a humid place as Washington DC. Particularly without air conditioning, you might be sympathetic to that. all sorts of stuff about animals, about plant life as well, being retarded in the United States, very common in 18th century commentary. These stereotypes, as I've said, throughout the last 200 years feed on a combination of truths, myths, urban legends, lies, some forms of evidence. This is kind of cocktail that I think all this discussion tends to involve, and therefore makes it quite hard to navigate our way through a sensible and kind of fruitful conversation. If you can't trust Caspar Weinberger to get the statistics right, who are you going to trust in these debates? So I suppose my whole role in writing these books on anti-Americanism and writing this current book on American insularity is to say we need a lot more work. There need a lot more people to be really seriously interested in this topic for us to have any sensible kind of conversation about it. Thank you. Question up the back.
You spoke of the internal critique within the United States, which mimics many of the same points you made. And I would argue that when I was in high school, you could start a fight by calling someone's sister a thespian. And it would, that sort of disconnect between the fact of a word and the impression that the word gave endures to this day in the kind of collective unconsciousness of the people around us. And part of the narrative is that when you raise those kinds of criticisms inside the United States, you're immediately branded as anti-American. You're immediately branded as an intellectual snob. And a whole host of narratives about you as a critic of America that tamp down any effort to raise the collective IQ of the country. So my question is, how does that, there are other narratives in the country that are intellectually curious, that are educated and progressive. Those kinds of stories don't make it to the forefront here. Is there any sense abroad that there is this other underlying narrative inside this country?
Don't take what I've said as my take on the United States. I think there's many narratives, and there's this is a particular negative story, and I in some ways I want to play with it and tease it and sort of test it and make fun of it to some extent. Of course, there are narratives, all sorts of narratives of intellectualism in the United States that probably aren't told to the degree that they deserve at times around the rest of the world. I mean, even those who look at the tables of global universities that are forced upon universities like my own that never get in the top 100 and have great aspirations to. The Americans, of course, are dominant in those kinds of tables, the Harvards of this world. So there are these narratives of the United States doing very well in the preservation of ideas and in the education of people in all sorts of ways. But I suppose my job and my sort of interest has been to look at these negative stories, and I think you're very much right in that sense of there is, of course, an anti-intellectual tradition. I mean, Richard Hofstadter wrote about this, I think, in fascinating ways, and he looks at that period that I've been talking about, and one of his points of analysis is that it's a period of revivalism in American Christianity. It's the style of religion that I think many Europeans found, and Trollope throughout her book, sort of alarming, speaking in tongues and the like that she talks about. This, for European sensibilities, is kind of some kind of craziness to a degree. And I suppose it's not maybe representative of how everyone was in the church at that time, but it's the story that they wanted to tell. And it was a story people find interesting outside the United States. So one of the great challenges, I think, for correspondence, foreign correspondence, and I know the BBC's head correspondent in Washington very well, a guy by the name of Justin Webb, is not to constantly tell those stories, but there are other stories to tell. You don't always go to the weirdest kind of version of the United States or the most anti-intellectual. There is always a receptive audience for that back home, and And the United States does a great service to the rest of the world because it provides a lot of good humour, for cartoonists and the like. But I think it is often overdone, and I'm concerned about this kind of evidential base for these types of things. This idea that only 20% of American representatives in the House and the Senate have passports. I mean, how constant that is sort of suggested is quite remarkable. Question up the back, and then, yeah.
I grew up in the Soviet Union and thinking of Reagan. I just have a very quick something because when I was much younger, my mom would, when my sister, my younger sister, would make us older five, my mom would call her Reagan. And I was like, what's Reagan about? After I go to school and I understood what she's talking about, you're right, it comes far from that time. But my question is, I haven't read your book, sorry about that, but have you looked at how Hollywood movies influence people's perception? Because later on in my life, I worked for U.S. Peace Corps and was convinced these people to accept American volunteers. And they would think about Van Damme, they would think about Schwarzenegger is coming, or like even American woman image. So I don't know if you looked at it.
Yeah, I mean, that's, that comes into my 20th century kind of part of my story. But I suppose that has been looked at to quite an extent. There is quite a literature on that, of how that shapes certain perceptions of the United States around the world. My argument is to say, well, it predates all of that. These travel writers, these novelists, they provide that kind of set of discussion about the United States that is just drawn on, and sometimes, used in a manner of parody. I mean, your Chevy Chase movies, the sort of European Vacation and the like. Mark Twain is incredible fun in this regard, of playing with these stereotypes and images, but because they're familiar, they speak to people, and people are, they make sense immediately. Where I think there's a point in Trollope's book where she talks about how few people she has come across who know some of the classical French literature. That at a certain point in history, that doesn't have a common resonance. I can't come into a room and start talking to you about various French writers from the 18th and 17th century and expect any familiarity, where I think these things have this instant familiarity.
Yeah, closer to your home, how do the Australians view the United States? And also, for the sake of comparison, how do Australian children that grow up, what kind of awareness do they have of the rest of the world, given the tyranny of distance, the fact that you're so far away from America, from Europe, and they have less and less opportunity for interaction? Yeah. I serve at the American Embassy in ACT, that's what you call Canberra, right?
Yeah.
Canberra. I find the Australian people very sympathetic to the United States.
Well, I think many of the things that have been said about Americans, these negative things I'm talking about, were said by British travellers and tourists about Australians. If Australia turned out to be a global power, the story might have been about anti-Australianism. There were many, and things were said about Australian nature. One of my favourite quotes from the Edinburgh Review was that Australia was nature's first draft, and a botched job at that. This was this place where all these weird animals like the platypus, it didn't make any sense. So in some ways, this notion of an uncouth nation
could have been a penal colony.
Yeah, it could have been this. So in some ways, Australians should be somewhat empathetic to this kind of what could be seen as a snobbish critique. But it always amused me when I looked through all of this to try to put an Australian angle to it, that the statistics that I could gain on Australia, and there was a great BBC set of surveys after 2001, which asked people, did they see the United States as culturally inferior to their country, as less sophisticated than their own country? And Australians overwhelmingly said yes. Now, some people who have travelled to Australia might find that amusing. It's probably not one of the most sophisticated countries in the world, and if you were coming from Cambridge, Harvard, you'd probably find it a rather uncouth place of its own. So I think these things are interesting, that just people have this kind of built-up belief about the United States, but Australians tend to have, surprisingly, for the amount of American culture we consume as a nation, quite a negative view of American culture. They're very much in line with this argument I'm making, but politically, Australians have tended to be more sympathetic to the United States than a lot of other countries. Hence, we have the troop involvement in the Iraq War, but also in all sorts of surveys, Australians are much keener to maintain strong military relations with the United States than a lot of other countries in the world, nearly most other countries.
Kind of a two-part question. As far as perceptions of how cultured Americans are and how sophisticated they are, has that varied throughout history? For example, post-World War II during the Marshall Plan, or maybe as America rises in economic status, and maybe when the Berlin Wall fell, for example, with the fall of communism. Has there been any deviation in how the world views American sophistication? I guess I'm speaking only to American sophistication. And then also, maybe kind of a tangential question is, are Europeans' views of American sophistication seems to be shaped by our knowledge of classical studies, which is namely Eurocentric studies. How does that compare to their views of maybe Asian people, and then how do Asian perceptions, for example, and I'm just throwing out Asians as just non-European people, how do their perceptions of American as far as being cultured, how does that compare to like European views of Americans being cultured?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the period that I've focused on is a kind of nadir. I mean, this is one of the worst periods in the constant sort of, reiteration of these negative stereotypes that, I mean, Malcolm Bradbury has looked at this, I think, as well as anyone. Bradbury sort of makes that argument and say things do improve. There are definitely periods where more positive images of Americans come out in travel writing, novels and the like. These things they at least become more complicated. They become different versions. So I suppose as a nadir, it just provides a kind of a pool of resources to draw upon when events, for whatever reason, often political events, turn in a way that outsiders don't like, that they can draw upon these things. And these things tend to come, the currency of these ideas tends to ebb and flow. So a period like the post-1945 period, there's reasons to be somewhat at least upbeat in parts of Europe about the United States in that period. So I think these ideas are not as frequently put forward as they say were in the 1920s. And they're much more common, particularly in France, and connected to fears about modernisation, all sorts of things. Then, of course, the Vietnam War. I mean, a whole set of images of both the American government's behaviour, but American soldiers and their behaviour, I think, draw upon those resources. This kind of word I've used a few times, the sort of notion of an ugly American. So there's definitely ebbs and flows. The views of Asians is an interesting question. I suppose it's a kind of more sophisticated way of looking at what I've done. You could draw upon, say, Edward Said's work, which draws quite heavily on travel writing and his concept of Orientalism. And I suppose those who've talked about this comparison have tended to see a kind of Asian culture as being sort of mystic, mystifying, have given it some sense of gravitas, longevity that is not afforded upon, white or European travellers or European immigrants who come to the United States. Newness is a problem, as you say. I mean, it doesn't go back to antiquity. It goes as a very short sort of period of life. So when Wilde makes this quote that, the youth of America never tire of giving you the full benefits of their inexperience, he's in some ways talking about his view of the United States in general.
Just a comment about your thing with the Soviet Union and the embassies. Back in the early 80s, I had a lady friend, and she was a KGB agent stationed here at the embassy. So I had a chance to visit the embassy quite a bit. And I can tell you, everybody in the embassy was fluent English speaker and had a great knowledge of America. Now, juxtaposed, 2 years ago, I made a speech in Miami before President Prevail of Haiti, and about 1,100 Haitian people. Jeb Bush brought me there, although I'm not a Bushite. Just an accident. But the new ambassador to Haiti was introduced at that time, and I've never met her before or since. She's a white lady, very healthy looking, not at all like she had every meal. And the very first line out of her mouth, she said, "I have to apologize. I know nothing about Haiti and I can't speak Creole." So, I mean, I think that it's a little bit deserved. Maybe it's our own system, because ambassadors are political appointees, very often don't know anything about the country that they're attached to.
Yeah, I don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to defend the way that American ambassadorial appointments are made. I mean, 30% is the figure often put out that of political appointees during the Bush period, or the George W. Bush period, being a high mark. That, you know, Australia and New Zealand, where I'm originally from, it is occasionally frustrating to have someone turn up and say, particularly I remember this living in New Zealand, and this might have been punishment for our nuclear-free policies in some regards, an ambassador coming in the late 80s saying, I'm a friend of the President's, I've never been to New Zealand, never even thought about it, don't know anything about New Zealand, but I'm here to learn. You know, an Australian ambassador couldn't get away with that, or a New Zealand ambassador arriving in Washington. So that, you know, those things do grate to some extent on locals. I mean, it's in some ways seen, or maybe rightly or wrongly, as a slap in the face. But I suppose the broader point of, did the Soviets who were sent to Laos or Vietnam or to Angola, or did all of them have this fluency that is often claimed? I'm not sure, and I'm somewhat dubious that, I mean, maybe these people were more specialist, but the degree of expertise, I'm not sure. The question there, isn't it?
Yeah. So anyway, it seems that you're saying that Americans do in fact know less about the outside world than other citizens of the United countries. Is that right?
There'd be some evidence to suggest that, but I think there tends to be an exaggeration of that evidence.
Okay, have you looked into the why of that? Is it the quality of the media, the information that we get? Have you looked at the possible causes of that?
Yeah, I suppose that's the kind of last
What did you discover?
last stage to say, I mean, particularly the media question is a good one. To say, okay, why is there some evidence that you can say the reporting of foreign news is decreasing in all sorts of venues in the United States. There'll be quite a lot of studies of this. You can put together a composite picture over time of showing a decrease in the amount of column space and all sorts of papers and whatnot for foreign news, and people have been engaging this for quite a while.
So like what studies have you seen along those lines?
Yeah, the studies, all of the
research.
yeah, those studies tend to suggest a decrease in that amount of information. Now, the answers to this that are often given in these types of studies is to say, well, this is somewhat financial, it's driven by interest. I mean, this tends to be the argument of a lot of editors who are asked this question. Why have you got less foreign correspondence than you had in the 70s or 80s? Many of their responses, and I've just been looking at this over the last week, is to say we surveyed our readership, we found that these things were read far less. We looked at what was clicked on internet pages, and the foreign news gets the least, least clicks.
We're not interested.
So there is, so, I mean, I need to do more work on this. I mean, I think there is a bit of a paucity of really serious thinking on this topic. But I suppose all I can do is kind of mount the evidence and then look for some kind of multiple explanation for it. There's a question there and then up there.
Okay, how much play do people like Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and so forth get abroad, and how are people abroad aware of these people and what they're saying, and does that form any kind of an impression?
Well, I'm an American politics junkie, so I have to get a tax-deductible cable news service. And with my cable package that I get in Australia, provided by Fox, which is really the only provider of cable television in Australia, I get one station that has 24 hours US news, and that, of course, is Fox News. And I think this would be replicated quite a lot throughout Asia because of the combination between Rupert Murdoch, an Australian company, of Sky and Fox, means that this would be the case in New Zealand, it would be the case in a number of Asian countries where Sky is one of the main sources of English language television. So with a whole range of other types of entertainment channels, I would get some kind of version of CNN on this package that I have, but it would be an international CNN, a bit asinine to be honest with you, but would cut in during American election campaigns, so it would switch out of CNN International into American CNN depending on the time of the sort of electoral cycle in the United States. But that would make a lot of Australians familiar with people like Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity, because that would be their only choice in some regards if they were news junkies like me. Rush Limbaugh, I think a lot of people would be familiar with him as a kind of a name, but as my knowledge stands, I don't think he's syndicated on Australian radio, or I don't think he's kind of had that kind of reach. I think his audience is just by the nature of radio as a form of technology, much more domestic.
I have sort of a comment and then a question. I'm a teacher, and I'm a history, geography teacher that tries to help kids see why these things are important. And it might be because they've interviewed or surveyed when they're high school seniors and they won't know how to find something like that. Something that I see is that there's and I think it might be growing, is the idea that because we consider ourselves the sole superpower now, that there's a sort of arrogance that comes, and the students pick up on that. And if you tell them it's important that they know where Yemen is for some reason, they'll say, well, no, it really doesn't, because we can dominate them, we're more powerful, we don't need to know. So that idea that if we're at war with them, they're geographically important, and a resource that we need, it might be, really comes into play. And I was kind of wondering if in your research of the early 19th century, if there was some of that arrogance there already, or if you agree that might be a cause where some of this ignorance is coming into play.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, very interesting question. I mean, one of the things that I think is apparent quite early on is that these stereotypes go both ways across the Atlantic. I mean, a lot of Americans in all types of forms are saying, we do not want to be the old world. We've left it behind. We're going to have Thomas Paine, or in the words of the founding fathers, in what might for some be a very inspirational way. But there are others in this kind of frontier who are wanting to very much break out of what they limitations of the old world, and a sense of that America was a better place. It's kind of annoying patriotism, which Tocqueville talks of. There's a sense of, this is a place of great freedom, opportunity for them, and reflecting that back on the old world as a stereotype. So from the beginnings, I think there is, Matthew Arnold goes on at great length about this in his book, American Civilization, about American boastfulness that you can see throughout that period. Your other point, though, I think is a really fascinating one to say, is it just the nature of being from a small place like I was born in New Zealand, that of course you've got to be interested in the rest of the world, because that's where the action is. That's where these people are calling the shots in many regards in the global sort of political game. And of course you're going to know more about the history of the United States than you could ever expect Americans to be interested in the history of New Zealand or Portugal. And I think this is problematic, because people want this to be reciprocated, their knowledge to be reciprocated of the United States. So I suppose the dynamics of power and size of your country and how that relates to what you know about the rest of the world, I think is quite fascinating and challenging for me to think about. But one of the other points, I want to cut somewhat against that, is to say, well, on that basis, maybe you just let Americans off if they knew a lot about the geography of their own country. Then you say, okay, well, it's a big country. At least if you're across your own country, you're doing well, because it's takes up as much space as a good part of the Eurasian continent, or at least Europe. But unfortunately, that's not the case in these kind of surveys. And maybe it's just that it comes back to it's not taught as much as it should, or people don't have maps in their houses, haven't prioritised having a globe at home or a map of their own country is something they do with their children, I suppose. This is what, having small kids myself, this is one of the things that constantly amazes me, that people just have some familiarity with their own children about these things. Because some of the surveys are really quite alarming. One that's quite out of date, but I'm constantly reminded of it, showed that the vast majority of American high school students couldn't name 4 countries in Africa. Which, any basic familiarity with the map. But that's a
Part of it that would play into it. And again, you were saying about Australians, British going with the comments that have about Australia. I think anthropologists going out into Africa around that period, again looking at the cultures, very one-sided view. That's the context that I see it in. I don't know if you agree or not.
Yeah, I mean, there's a European standard in some regards, as the sort of height of civilization, and then these places in some ways are a disappointment, but, I mean, particularly the American frontier, but this isn't entirely true. I mean, the best comprehensive study that I've seen of American kind of public life and education and book reading and all sorts of fascinating things is Charles Mumford Jones's book on influence of French culture in America. It sounds an unlikely title in the period that I'm looking at. And Mumford Jones looks at the amount of libraries in the United States, book borrowing, the number of Harvard and Oxford educated men, as he calls it, and he shows that in New England, many of these things, in parts of Virginian society, many of these things are entirely comparable to Britain at the time. I mean, there's not some huge gap in kind of what you might crudely call kind of the learned class. There's a lot, in fact, it's just a tremendous amount of similarity. But it's these places that I was referred to as the frontier, where there isn't the institutions of public libraries immediately set up, where there isn't people who have, Oxford and Cambridge learning, going to set up new universities. This all takes time, of course. And so these people are judged in these places, maybe harshly or unfairly, but that's what's interesting, because it's different. And it's sort of, you're drawn to it, as people are still about all sorts of strange things in America.
Can I make one final brief point? Sorry, but then so then you look at today with where America was in the world, and American ignorance or anything, but the fact is they've done something that's right, and they've got to the position where they are today. There's something there that's succeeded.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not endorsing all of these views. I'm not saying that this is a society which is encumbered by 300 years of failure because of these things. I mean, one of the most remarkable things, and I think I think it's Walter Russell Mead's book, Special Providence, really gets at this, and I think in a very sophisticated, interesting way, is to say, why is there this commentary, not just about American culture, but about American diplomatic policy, about America as a sort of as a global sort of statesperson, that is so overwhelmingly negative, but the results suggest quite a lot of success. And there's a mismatch here. What's going on? And Mead tries to explain that through these four traditions of American foreign policy. It's a fascinating book. I mean, I recommend it to all of you. And his sort of nutshell, part of his answer is that democracies are messy. That in democracies you have messy mass cultures would be part of my argument. Mead's argument is the foreign policy of democracies looks a shambles. I think he invokes Fisher Ames. Fisher Ames once said, comparing European and American foreign policy, he said European foreign policy looks like a large cruise liner or a huge frigate. It looks sturdy, impenetrable, it looks like it's going to do the job. But if it hits a sort of an iceberg or a rock, it sinks to the bottom without trace, and you're devastated. Where American foreign policy looks like someone in a raft. You get your feet wet constantly, it looks a shambles, but somehow the raft kind of continues along the river. And I think that's a brilliant analogy, that it's kind of does look baffling often from the outside, but it is, there's a degree of great success to it all. So I think this is one of the great challenges looking at this kind of topic.
Yeah, there's a number of things, but I wanted to concentrate on the point you were making about Victorian sensibilities, and you've touched on this, and forgive me for being late, you may have addressed this right at the beginning, but to what extent do you think it really is understandable, the British reaction was really through fear of the mob, driven by class and the class structure of Britain at the time, and this fear when we're looking across the water at a relatively classless society. And I think for me that's what drives it.
Yeah.
And then if I could just make another point, leaping up to the 70s, and as you've said, a lot of this is anecdotal, which is very dangerous, but there's a lot of jealousy also, I think, from the Europeans' point of view. There's an arrogance perhaps coming from that fear and that class-ridden society. There's also an economic jealousy, especially I could see it myself in the 1970s, when we thought about Americans, we thought, gosh, they're so rich, they can come over here and travel in Europe. And even at that level, I think the Europeans have been driven by their past to have these kinds of...
Yeah, I mean, I think you're dead right in many regards, because it is a period of social upheaval in Britain with the reform laws and the like, and I think these people brings Tory sensibilities, Victorian sensibilities to bear tremendously, but at the same time I think we'd be wrong to dismiss it all and say, well look, these are sort of anxious Europeans who were conservatives often, who were resistant to forms of change, because there's some degree of kind of, there's the enduring nature of these things which I think make them hard to ignore, but there's also a side to it which I think would be wrong to just throw it all out. I mean, there's claims of hypocrisy. I mean, faced with this sort of institution of slavery, I mean, I think this should be taken quite seriously, and this has been it mixes with some of these stereotypes that I've been talking about and caricatures to be, I think in very many regards, a very legitimate set of worries and concerns that a lot of these writers point to, and was one of the big things in all of this travel writing around the time, with this thing of how come they say all these things in the United States, but what are they doing to these African American people, or these Indian people, or the like? So that's there, and I think needs to be taken quite seriously. I mean, the point about the American tourist, I suppose, this sort of relates to, comes out of this period, is that Margaret Fuller, who starts to write about the American tourist in this period, maybe sort of 1850s, 1860s, where a lot of her language, you could see that in the cartoon of the American tourist that was, throughout my childhood, that you saw all the time. If you saw a cartoon of American tourists, it was the same. It was a loud Hawaiian shirt, a massive camera, and sort of rather overweight. And this was as Fuller in the 18 without the camera. But there was a kind of there was the same kind of image that was there to be drawn upon constantly. It makes cartooning it too easy in some regards. Yes.
Have you noticed any changes in the stereotypes since Barack Obama was elected, or are they just too long-standing?
I mean, of course, there are many other versions that people have of Americans. I mean, this is just, I'm talking about the most negative in many regards. There are other views. There's proliferation of so many images of America through television, music videos, all sorts of things. So, of course, people have other images as well of Americans. I think I was saying before this talk that one of the things I find fascinating about the use of Obama's face is just how regularly I travelled last year throughout New Zealand on the way home from the United States, and then a bit of travel in Australia. And I constantly saw pictures of Barack Obama being used to advertise world music festivals or world food festivals or Rastafarian concerts. And there were occasions where I just sort of thought, they're using a US president to do that? Some kind of vegan peace fest or something. It was a little bit too much for me in some ways, having just come from the United States and studying Bush for a long time, to think, well, God, and then I suppose it says more about these people than probably about Barack Obama. That, of course, there are always this strange combination of these grave fears of the United States, coupled with these great hopes that the United States transcends all sorts of things, politically even, and that someone like Obama could really live up to those dreams. So that the expectations, in some ways, are incredible. And even after Bush, to bounce back in many regards, that the people who would have been the most cynical about the United States, Rastafarian vegetarians, wouldn't have, I wouldn't have thought the United States had the sort of the standing to ever be used for getting people to a concert. But it is quite remarkable how plastic the images can be in some ways, and I think that's what makes studying your country very interesting. That you don't get sort of stuck for too long and just in a particular trend. It's a degree of interest by a sort of variety.
one of the things that I think you just pointed out to is this question of American behavior. To what extent does American behavior affect the way we look at the United States? I've done some work on how the media covers the Middle East. And one of the things that I found out, how the view of people in the Middle East has evolved toward the United States. For example, people didn't know much about America up until the latter part of the 19th century. And how did they know about it? They knew about it basically through two ways. One was when after the Homestead Act, where the U.S. government gave free land to farmers. 10 years later, people in the Middle East began to hear that the King of America was giving land to peasants. And so some of the people from the Middle East began to come to the United States. And these people stayed, some of them made some money and went back. And some of those who stayed would write letters to their relatives, tell them about America. This is a different country, a country of opportunity, a country where people are treated equally regardless of background. Everybody's equal before the law. That was one way. The second way was through American missionaries. American missionaries went to the Middle East. They wanted to convert the heathens, but they didn't do a very good job. They ended up converting some Christian, Middle Eastern Christians, to Western forms of Christianity. But what did they do? They built hospitals, they built clinics, they built great universities like the American University of Beirut, the American University of Cairo, and people to this day, these universities, these clinics, left a tremendous impact on the views of America, what America is like. So when the First World War ended, people wanted to have freedom, and when they couldn't have independence, President Wilson sent the King Crane Commission. They asked people, what would you like to see? What kind of government would you like to have over? And they told them, we want to be independent. They said, it doesn't look like you're going to get independence. You're going to get a mandate. And they said, look, if we have to have a mandate, we want an American mandate. We don't want a French mandate, although they had, or a British mandate, but that's what they ended up with. So recently, I think the point that you just made is very important about the different visions of America. There is, for example, today in the Middle East, people admire America because of its music, its art, its culture, the films, its the opportunity, the land of opportunity, but at the same time, a lot of people also criticize U.S. interventionism, the Abu Ghraib, the Guantanamo's, the war in Iraq. So you have different visions.
Sure, and thank you for that, because I mean my studies are fairly Eurocentric. I mean these were the first travelers in general. I mean there was some coming up from the new sort of societies in Latin America in this period as well, but the majority of commentary is European voices. It takes a later time, and I suppose I think there needs to be more written about this. There is a curiosity that the cultural critique of the United States is not as apparent in all sorts of survey evidence in the Middle East. I mean, this is a source of great frustration about the United States. The cultural critique is much more common in places like Australia, France, in the UK, that you see that there's more of common, there's something which people seem to find more instantly frustrating in surveys. There's much more political content in the critique of the United States that you find in the Middle East in the comparative surveys that I've looked at. And I suppose it brings you to the other point, which I don't really make in this talk, but in really an earlier work on anti-Americanism, where I very much argue that these things aren't just always enduring and you can't do much about them. Policy matters a lot. I mean, if I talked of ebbs and flows in the 20th century, once we do have data measuring opinions in different countries, US policy tracks pretty clearly to how those ebbs and flows of favourability or unfavourability of Americans rises and falls. I mean, it's during periods of the Vietnam War it goes down, it's during the periods where the Pershing missiles are sent to Europe in the 80s, there's sort of tensions over those issues where you see negativity towards the United States really rise in public opinion surveys in the 80s. You see it during the lead up to the Iraq War. It tracks to policy quite clearly. And I think this makes a nonsense. I mean, it's even Madeline Albright has made this argument that the only thing which will lead to America being seen more favourable in the world is by America becoming weaker, less powerful, that it's all to do with American power. There's no real evidence to suggest that if you look at the statistics. It clearly shows that America at a point of enormous power at the end of the Cold War or during the 1990s is far more popular than it becomes during the 21st century. And as you could say, the relative power of the United States hasn't changed that much, but the policies, to some significant degree in some areas, do change. Yeah.
I have a question about the Jewish intellectual community in Europe at that time. A lot of those people were placed in America. Einstein, being a leader in that regard. What was their opinion of the American intellectual situation, and did they have any influence back in Europe on the overall opinion by the European public? They seem very enthusiastic about it.
Yeah. I mean, depending who you're talking about, complicated in some ways. I mean, the picture of the relationship between the European Jewish population and the image of the United States, I think, is just 2 points I want to make. That there's a fascinating period of commentary, particularly in France, somewhat also in Germany, and there's some Hitler's rhetoric at times you get this, where America is criticised in that period of the 1920s, late 1920s, early 1930s, for being the home of the European Jew or the Jew, that there's an anti-Semitism and an anti-Americanism that you can quite clearly see in quite a lot of that commentary in the late 1920s in France. They're often very conservative commentary. It's used by Hitler at various points. There's some, very anti-American, very anti-Semitic rhetoric that he uses to look at that after a period of great immigration of European Jews. What about European Jews themselves? Really a question of that period where they moved across the United States, obviously involved in the film industry, European intellectuals escaping Nazi Germany and the like. It's a complex mix. Some of the most sort of ardent critics of the United States at a thoroughgoing level come in that period. One-Dimensional Man, written in the 1950s. That these, people out of that German intellectual tradition who in many ways struggle with the culture they find, and some more sophisticated ways use the sort of terms of this is a country they find, not up to their hopes and dreams in the level of cultural sophistication. Combined with this fear of technology. That was this news story of the 20th century, and a lot of these critical intellectuals involved some Jewish intellectuals from Germany. There was this strange combination of American technological advancement and a kind of cultural, what they saw as often a cultural backwardness that would combine in their imagery of the United States in that commentary. One more question we have time for? Or one there and maybe a repeat up the back?
I don't know if you'll know, because as you said, yours is more Eurocentric, and we talk about other regions, but we haven't talked at all about Latin America. Has there been anything done on a Latin view of Europe?
Yeah. There's a lot of work in that area, and there's some very good scholars in that area, so I don't want to trample on areas where people are far more expert than I am. But I think it comes later. It starts to come around the mid-19th century. You see all sorts of kind of novels writing about the United States. And I think there is a sort of, that literature, and that I suppose I've edited quite a few chapters on this, where people talk about it, is that in their work, is that it often draws upon similar conceptions of the United States as much more materialistic than the Latin American societies, or the United States is much more drawn to a kind of forms of individualism. So in some ways in that Latin American writing you see much more of a European sensibility and very similar concerns in some ways from the literature I know. And my knowledge certainly isn't that comprehensive, but I think there's quite a lot of overlap between those two sets of commentary. But the Latin American literature tends to come a bit later. Last question.
This kind of brings us full circle because you spoke about the critique from the film industry in the 50s, and we have the competing narratives of Joe McCarthy versus the people that were blackballed by the House Committee of Un-American Activities. And those competing narratives are seen again in the Bush administration, where you were either with us or against us. So we have this kind of blustery, arrogant, ignorant, don't care about the rest of the world because we're more powerful than the rest of the world, versus people who are more cosmopolitan, more educated, more sophisticated, and trying to move the country into a more open society. So I think those competing narratives are played out around the world, and I guess the question is, to what extent does the election of Barack Obama advance?
I suppose I kind of finish on a more somber note to say that, I mean, one of the problems when I started out doing all this research that I kind of had quite strongly fixed in my mind was that stereotypes or images of America tended towards extremes. They tended towards this kind of sensationalism of a focus on, you know, American kind of barbarism as Wildwood put it, or George Bernard Shaw in his famous statement about America going, you know, through the process of civilization and missing civilization, going straight to decadence. The sense of America being a kind of an extreme case of this sort of culture. But then there's a sort of the good Americans like Barack Obama, or you know, people that I teach are very sort of fixated with the West Wing and the kind of version of the president there. But to me, seems to miss this basic kind of fact that, like all societies, the dominant story is one of ordinariness, of people doing ordinary things which are fairly similar to what people do in many, many other countries which are, you know, of a similar kind of level of economic development. I think that story is so often missed in the kind of sense that America is, maybe by its own portrayal at times, but sensationalised to create these kind of either-ors. And it tends to sort of give, I mean, too much energy in some regards to these stereotypes that I've been talking about, and maybe a lack of attention to say they're not completely a different species. You know, they're people too. I think it was missing a lot, particularly during the Bush period, from a lot of commentary that I came across. So I kind of wanted to, you know, it's not a very glamorous story. You know, just talk about not everyone's got a gun. You know, not everyone's, and it's very simple things that you know, that I think people they're sort of drawn to a much more extreme version of your own society that I think is fair in a broad sense. Thank you for your time.